US carriers. At the centre of all this, obviously, is our conflict between the United States and Iran at the moment, which is playing out in Iraq. We're going to talk to Assal Rad, who is a senior fellow at the National Iranian-American Council, on Skype from Irvine, California. Assal, thank you for your time. Central to this, and I was talking to our correspondent about this before, is whether you view this as retaliation or escalation. Iran is being very clear to say this is retaliation. These rocket attacks are retaliation for the killing of General Qasem Soleimani, but it's whether or not the United States, and particularly Donald Trump, chooses to view it as that. Absolutely. And to give credit to President Trump, when credit is due, his reaction on Twitter has been quite different. It seems to be restrained. There's a sort of reassuring tone, though it's still very concerning to have to wait till the morning to hear what the United States intends to do. And so we'll have to wait until then to have a full assessment, and a full detail of what actually happened. We have to be very careful not to jump to any conclusions. There were earlier reports that there were 30 casualties. Now we're saying there doesn't seem to be casualties. So we don't have all of the information to draw conclusions from. In terms of the Iranian side, it would be wise to think about Iranian decisions, not just in this situation that we're seeing now, but over the last year and a half since the United States pulled out of the nuclear deal. Iran has taken very clear, measured steps after the United States quit the nuclear deal. And it seems as though this is another very carefully measured retaliation. It was explicitly stated by Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif that this was a retaliation, that Iran does not seek an escalation and does not seek war. So we'll have to see what the United States assesses. OK, so there's retaliation, there's escalation, and there's a third prong, which could be diplomacy. Do you see any room for diplomacy, given the fact that Javad Zarif can't get into the United States at the moment, it seems? He can't get a visa. And Mike Pompeo, even though he is technically the chief diplomat of the United States, is probably not the most diplomatic player. There's always room for diplomacy, and that's because what the United States and Iran have done in the past is there are third parties who can facilitate that diplomacy. And unfortunately, because of what's happened since the United States with the Iran deal, those channels for diplomacy have been closed. But there is always room for diplomacy before we hit a full-scale conflict. It's very important to remind ourselves that this is not a full-scale conflict. For the same thing that we reminded ourselves just 5 days ago, when the U.S. assassination of Qasem Soleimani was carried out, this is still not a full-scale conflict, and that has to be emphasized. There's still a road for diplomacy. To note the idea of diplomacy, looking at what Iran announced in terms of the JCPOA, Iran did not quit the JCPOA. The decision that they made to reduce their last limitation was something that they had decided before the assassination of Soleimani. So this was, again, a series of steps that Iran had planned to take. Specifically, in their statement, they said that if sanctions were lifted and all parties returned to the deal, they would return to the deal as well. So that means the framework of the deal is still in place, and that deal is emblematic of diplomacy. Who can play that diplomatic role? I believe I've read in the past that Switzerland's been involved, the classic neutral player. Who else has got some leverage with either side or both sides at the moment? Oman has played a role as mediator in the past. You have Japan, who's tried to play a role. The French president has tried to play a role. At this point, really, any party that can communicate between the two sides should intervene, because whatever conflict, whatever escalation could occur is not something that will be isolated to Iran and the United States. Of course, everybody knows that it will have extreme blowback within the region itself. But the consequences go further than that. This is really an issue of global impact, and so we need those parties to intervene. Assal Rad joining us from Irvine, California. She's with the National Iranian-American Council. Great to talk to you. Thank you. Thank you very much.